My own parents sued me because I refused to pay my golden sister's mortgage. They always put Julia first, while I was left as the backup plan, the scapegoat, the one blamed for everything. Now I have to fight not just for money, but for my life and the right to finally be free. I refuse to pay for my sister's mortgage. If that sounds insane, buckle up, because this isn't just about money, it's about a lifetime of being the backup plan, the scapegoat, the one they could always sacrifice to keep Julia, my older sister, safe and shining. I'm Catherine, 29 years old, working in tech, renting a modest apartment I can actually afford, and living a life I built on long hours, scholarships, and discipline. My sister Julia is 31, the golden child, the adored one, the sunshine, while I was always the storm cloud. That's not a metaphor, by the way. That was their nickname for me. When I was 12, they laughed about it in front of family friends. Julia's our sunshine, Catherine's our storm cloud. Everyone chuckled. I smiled weakly, but inside I hated it. Over time it became less of a joke and more of a rule. Julia was light. I was shadow. When Julia crashed her car at 17, I got grounded because I should have been there to stop her. When Julia failed math, I was forced to tutor her after school, even when it meant neglecting my own homework. When she dropped out of college after 2 semesters, my parents raided my savings account, the one I'd built working nights at a grocery store, to cover her tuition debt. The excuse was always the same: family helps family. But somehow, that family help never seemed to point in my direction. When I got into the state science fair at 15, I begged them to come watch. They didn't show up, they were at Julia's cheerleading finals. When I got my first job out of college, I invited them to dinner to celebrate. They came, but the entire evening was spent discussing Julia's new boyfriend, whether he was the one, how excited they were for her future. I was invisible unless I was useful, and being useful always meant serving Julia. Fast forward to last year. Julia decided she wanted a house. Not a small starter home. A big one with high ceilings and a kitchen straight out of a magazine. Way out of her budget. But of course my parents co-signed the mortgage. I warned them. I begged them not to. I told them she wasn't ready, that she'd fall behind. They rolled their eyes and said I was being negative, jealous even, as though caution was a crime. Less than a year later, Julia defaulted. And suddenly my phone was full of missed calls. First, Mom, crying, if you could just cover a few payments, Julia can get back on her feet. Then Dad, cold and stern, you're the only one in the family who's financially stable. It's your duty. And Julia herself, endless texts dripping with guilt. If you don't help, I'll lose the house. Do you want that on your conscience? I said no. Over and over. This isn't my responsibility. That's when the tone shifted. The guilt trips turned into threats. Don't expect us to be there when you need us. You're abandoning your own blood. You're selfish. And then came the lawsuit. I'll never forget the day I opened that envelope. I was in my kitchen, coffee half made, sunlight spilling across the counter. I tore it open, and the words hit me like a punch. Plaintiffs: Thomas and Elaine, my parents. Defendant: Catherine, me. I dropped the papers onto the floor. My stomach turned ice cold. I called them immediately, hoping there was some mistake. My dad answered, calm, like this was nothing unusual. Cat, you left us no choice, he said. No choice. As if dragging your daughter into court was as ordinary as taking out the trash. Then Mom came on the line, her voice trembling, but the words sharp. Sweetheart, it's not personal. Julia needs this. You're her sister. You have a responsibility. That word again. Responsibility. I almost laughed, but it came out like a sob. Because in that moment, I realized the truth I'd been avoiding my whole life. This wasn't about Julia's house. It wasn't even about money. It was about years of being the fallback option, the storm cloud, the afterthought. I wasn't just invisible anymore. I was disposable. That night I sat alone in my apartment, the lawsuit papers spread across the table. I read the numbers over and over until the ink blurred. They wanted me to pay Julia's mortgage. Not once, not temporarily, but locked in, $2,300 every month, until Julia stabilized. Knowing her, That meant never. I thought about the times I gave her money before, the times I bailed her out, the endless cycle of sacrifice. And now they wanted to make it permanent. My parents. My own blood. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. My hands shook just holding the papers. And the only question echoing in my head, louder and louder, was this: how did it come to this? The days after receiving the lawsuit blurred together, like living underwater where every sound was muffled and every thought came in slow, painful waves. But when I finally forced myself to sit down and read the entire complaint line by line, I felt my jaw tighten with every sentence. It wasn't just about the mortgage, it was written as though I had a legal duty to support Julia indefinitely, citing family obligations and some bizarre claims that I had promised to help her when she bought the house, which was a complete lie, and worse, my parents had signed sworn statements painting me as cold, ungrateful, and neglectful, like I was some cruel stranger instead of their daughter. I remember staring at the page where they described me as someone who hoarded wealth while her sister struggled, and it was like being stabbed. I live in a rented apartment. I drive a 7-year-old Honda. I budget carefully because I don't want to end up like Julia, yet suddenly I was framed as a villain in my own family story. I didn't know the first thing about fighting a lawsuit, so I Googled frantically, called hotlines, and finally scraped together the courage to reach out to a lawyer recommended by a coworker. His name was Daniel, late 30s, calm, the kind of person who listened without interrupting, and when I spread the papers across his desk, he raised his eyebrows and let out a low whistle. I've seen some wild cases, but suing your own kid to pay for another? That's new. For the first time in days, I laughed sharp, bitter, but it felt like breathing again. He explained that in the eyes of the law, parents couldn't simply invent a financial obligation like this. The case was flimsy, emotional blackmail dressed in legal clothing, but he warned me it could still drag out, cost me time, money, and most painfully, any shred of relationship I had left with my family. I told him that relationship was already dead, but even saying it made my chest ache. Meanwhile, my parents didn't slow down. They called, left voicemails dripping with outrage, and Julia flooded my inbox with long messages full of capital letters and exclamation points. "Do you realize what you're doing to me? I'm your sister," as if yelling made her case stronger. They even started reaching out to extended relatives, twisting the story until cousins and aunts began texting me about how family should stick together. I wanted to scream that I had stuck together for years, but no one wanted to hear my side. Daniel prepared me for the first hearing, a preliminary session just to set dates and see if settlement was possible. Walking into that courthouse was surreal. I've only ever seen them in movies, but the fluorescent lights, the cold tile floors, and the echo of my own footsteps made it feel like I was walking toward an execution. And then I saw them. My parents, sitting with Julia in the hallway outside the courtroom, dressed neatly like they were attending church. Mom avoided my eyes, Dad stared right through me, and Julia actually had the audacity to smile, like this was some game she was already winning. My stomach turned, but I kept walking, clutching my folder like armor. Inside, the judge glanced over the paperwork, asked a few sharp questions, and I could tell, even she seemed confused why this had been filed at all. But still, she didn't dismiss it outright. She scheduled further hearings, told both sides to prepare evidence, and that was it. 10 minutes that changed the entire landscape of my life. I walked out shaking, half from adrenaline, half from rage. My parents brushed past me without a word, Julia trailing behind them with a smug little bounce in her step, and for a second I thought about running after them, grabbing them, begging them to stop, but the words curdled in my throat. Because I finally understood, they didn't want to stop. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. They wanted to break me, financially, emotionally, completely. That night I sat in Daniel's office again, going over strategies, but while he explained discovery and motions and timelines, all I could think about was how my own blood had turned into my enemies. And deep down, a question began to burn hotter and hotter. If they were willing to drag me this far, how far was I willing to go to fight back? The weeks that followed felt like living inside a pressure cooker, because the lawsuit wasn't just about court dates and documents. It spilled into every corner of my life, poisoning friendships, work, even my sense of self. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years were suddenly messaging me on Facebook with guilt-laced sermons about how Julia had always been the fragile one, and how I needed to remember that parents won't be around forever, so it's my duty to step up now. At work, I caught coworkers whispering after seeing Julia's passive-aggressive posts online, thinly veiled prayers about betrayal and abandonment that were clearly directed at me, and though I tried to block and ignore, screenshots always found their way back. My phone became an enemy. Every buzz meant another voicemail from Mom, crying so loudly it distorted, begging me to do the right thing, or Dad's cold monotone demanding I settle before I ruined the family's reputation. The financial strain started digging in too. Daniel warned me this could stretch on for months, maybe years, and every hour of his time meant another bill. I began selling small things, old jewelry, electronics, clothes, anything to soften the blow, and each time I packed up a box for shipment I thought about Julia's house, the oversized mortgage she had chosen, the vacations she still took even after claiming she was drowning. My resentment grew sharper, but so did my clarity. This wasn't about money, it was about roles. Julia was the chosen child, and I was the designated safety net, expected to bleed quietly whenever she stumbled. Once I stopped seeing it as a single fight over dollars, everything clicked into place. The court process itself moved slowly but mercilessly. Discovery meant combing through old emails, bank statements, and text messages, all being scrutinized like I was some criminal. My parents' attorney filed motion after motion trying to drag me into corners, requests for my financial records, my work history, even personal correspondence. Reading their accusations in black and white made me feel hollow, that I had withheld promised support, that I had unduly enriched myself while others suffered. None of it was true, but I realized truth mattered less than persistence. The judge, to her credit, began pushing back, asking pointed questions during hearings, but she still let the case crawl forward. And then came the ambush. One afternoon, Daniel slid a packet across the table during prep, sworn affidavits from my own relatives. My aunt claimed I had bragged about never helping Julia a dime. My cousin insisted I told her years ago that family debt was beneath me. Lies, all of them, but powerful on paper. I felt the room spin, the betrayal cutting so deep I couldn't breathe. Daniel squeezed my hand gently and said, "They're circling wagons, but remember, consistency wins." His calm anchored me, but at night I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how many more knives were waiting behind smiling faces. The first actual trial date loomed, and with it, the dawning realization that this wasn't just about surviving the courtroom, it was about redefining who I was. If I caved, I'd confirm every role they'd written for me. If I fought, I'd become the villain in their family mythology. Somewhere in that tension, a colder, stronger version of myself began to take root, and for the first time in my life, I didn't just want to defend myself, I wanted to win. Walking into the courtroom that morning felt like stepping into a nightmare I had rehearsed 1,000 times in my head, but never thought would materialize, the air heavy and sterile, buzzing with whispers from strangers who didn't know me but already looked at me with curiosity, some with pity, and my hands were trembling so badly that Daniel had to place his over mine just to steady me, his calmness the only anchor I had in that sea of tension. My parents were already seated at the opposite table, their posture stiff and formal, as if they were the grieving victims of some terrible injustice, while Julia sat between them in a new dress that screamed of money she claimed not to have. Her lips pressed together in a performance of quiet suffering, the kind of practiced expression I'd seen her wear since childhood whenever she needed sympathy, and I thought back to those moments when she'd cry over broken curfews or bad grades and my parents would swoop in with comfort, leaving me alone with my forgotten science trophies. The judge entered, and the room fell into silence, her presence commanding enough that for a brief second I believed maybe, just maybe, the truth could finally be heard here, not the warped version of it that my parents had spun my entire life. Their lawyer began first, his voice calm and authoritative, laying out a narrative that painted me as cold and selfish, a daughter who turned her back on family values, someone who had benefited from years of parental sacrifice, only to refuse help when it was her turn to give back. And with every word I felt my stomach twist tighter, because this wasn't just a lawsuit, it was character assassination, carefully scripted. And I saw the slight nods from my parents as if each sentence confirmed the story they had rehearsed together in private. Then came Daniel's turn, his voice steady, clinical, almost surgical as he dismantled their claims, pointing out that no contract existed, no agreement was ever made. That what they were really demanding was not legal justice, but the enforcement of a one-sided family code where one child is the provider and the other is the recipient. And as he spoke, I could feel a shift in the room, a subtle lean forward of the judge, a tightening in the faces of those listening. But the real crucifixion began with the testimonies. Julia went first, her voice soft, almost trembling as she told the court about her desperate situation, how she had begged me for help, how I had promised to step in but cruelly abandoned her, letting her sink while I flourished in my career, and she even looked at me across the room with eyes glistening as though we were sisters torn apart by tragedy rather than manipulator and mark. My nails dug into my palms as Daniel rose for the cross-examination, his tone respectful but relentless, asking her for dates, for texts, for any form of proof that I had ever promised to take over her mortgage, and she faltered, her answers vague, circular, leaning instead on the idea of implied duty. And finally, when pressed, she admitted no, she never said the exact words, but she knew family comes first, and the room went utterly still because what she had admitted wasn't a contract, it was an expectation built on entitlement. Then my father took the stand, and his words cut deeper than hers, not because of their content, but because of the calm conviction with which he delivered them, saying things like, "We raised her better than this," and "family means sacrifice, not selfishness." And I could feel the old, familiar shame clawing its way back, the kind that had followed me since childhood when nothing I did was ever enough, when Julia's needs always eclipsed mine, and suddenly I was 15 again, standing alone on a stage at a science fair with no one in the audience to clap for me because my parents had chosen a cheerleading competition instead. My mother followed, her voice shaky but dramatic, speaking of disappointment, of heartbreak, of how they had never thought they would see the day their own daughter dragged them to court, and I almost laughed out loud because the reversal of reality was so brazen. It wasn't me dragging them anywhere. They had filed this case, they had put me in this chair, and still they twisted the narrative so completely that if I didn't know the truth myself, I might have believed them. Finally, it was my turn, and I rose with legs that felt like they might collapse under me, my voice trembling at first, but growing steadier with every word as I told my story. Not the one they painted, but the real one, the years of being overlooked. The constant sacrifices, the way love in our household had always been conditional, given to Julia freely but doled out to me only when I played the role of provider or caretaker. I told the judge that this case wasn't about money but about control, about a lifetime of favoritism turned into legal warfare, and as I spoke, I saw the cracks forming, my parents shifting uncomfortably, Julia looking away. And for the first time in my life, I didn't care if they hated me for it, because the truth was finally out, not whispered in therapy rooms or journal entries, but laid bare in a court of law. By the time I stepped down, my chest felt raw, like I had ripped open wounds I'd carried for decades, but beneath the pain there was a strange lightness, a sense of something breaking free, though the day ended without a verdict, adjourned to another session. And as I walked out of that courtroom with Daniel at my side, I realized the outcome almost didn't matter anymore, because for the first time, I wasn't the scapegoat, I was someone who had finally fought back. The second day in court felt different from the start, heavier somehow, as though the walls themselves were bracing for confessions that no one wanted to say out loud, and I walked in with my chest tight, knowing this wasn't just another round of accusations, but the point where truths either cracked open or got buried forever, because Daniel had hinted at evidence we hadn't yet revealed, something he'd been holding back like an ace in the sleeve. And the thought both comforted and terrified me. Since my entire childhood had taught me that no matter what proof I had, my parents' word was always taken as gospel over mine. The judge began by recapping the first day, her tone professional but sharp, already showing signs of impatience with the theatrics my family had staged, and I caught Julia whispering fiercely to our mother, her face pale despite the makeup, her hands clutching a coffee cup like it was her last defense, and in that moment I wondered if she finally realized that this wasn't going the way she expected, that maybe for the first time in her life, her performance wasn't winning the room. The testimonies resumed, but this time the focus shifted from emotional pleas to hard facts. The mortgage documents, Julia's finances, bank transfers that Daniel's team had painstakingly gathered to show how her debt wasn't just a tragic accident, but the result of reckless spending, vacations and designer clothes and impulsive choices that painted a very different picture from the helpless victim she pretended to be. And as those numbers rolled out on the projector, I felt both vindicated and sick to my stomach, because it was one thing to know in private that she had wasted money, but another to see it dissected in public, exposed in ways that stripped her of all the illusions she'd wrapped herself in for years. Julia squirmed in her seat, her lips twitching with barely contained fury, and when Daniel asked her directly, "Would you agree that these expenditures, five-star resorts, luxury handbags, were not essential living costs?" she stammered, trying to spin it as stress relief, but her voice cracked, and even the judge's eyebrows rose in disbelief, the silence in the room loud with the weight of her unraveling credibility. My father tried to recover ground, insisting that Julia's mistakes didn't erase family duty, that I, as the more successful daughter, still had an obligation to step in, but Daniel countered with something none of us had expected. Old financial records showing that my parents had quietly co-signed Julia's first failed loan years ago, bailing her out without ever telling me, while continuing to demand sacrifices from me under the guise of equality, and the gasp that rippled through the courtroom hit me harder than anything, because it wasn't just proof of favoritism, it was proof of deceit, hidden behind years of guilt-tripping. My mother looked shattered for a moment, her mask slipping, eyes darting toward Julia as though blaming her for dragging this all into the open, and I realized then how fragile their entire facade had always been. A house of cards built on secrets and expectations that collapsed the second anyone dared to shine light on it. When it was my turn to be questioned again, I no longer trembled. I spoke of that betrayal, how I had lived my life believing I was selfish for drawing boundaries, while all along the truth was that I had been manipulated into carrying more than my share. And the words poured out of me not as a rehearsed defense, but as decades of suppressed rage and grief finally finding air. I admitted that yes, I was financially stable. Yes, I could have paid Julia's mortgage if I wanted to, but that wasn't the point, because love that demands proof in the form of money isn't love, it's control. And for the first time I saw nods from strangers in the audience, people who had likely lived their own versions of this nightmare, and the validation was so overwhelming that I had to swallow hard not to cry right there on the stand. Then Daniel revealed the ace he had kept hidden. Emails between my parents and Julia, discussing how to frame me in this case, talking about me not as a daughter, but as a resource to be tapped, strategizing how to make me look guilty and corner me into paying, and when those words lit up the courtroom screens, the silence was deafening, followed by a visible shift in the judge's expression from neutral to sharp disapproval. My parents sat frozen, their lawyer fumbling to object, but the damage was done, and though part of me felt like throwing up, another part of me felt freer than I ever had, because for once it wasn't just me saying I had been used. It was their own words proving it, undeniable, in black and white. By the time the day ended, the case was no longer about whether I had failed them, it was about whether they had abused me, and the reversal of that power dynamic left them stunned, silent. Their once unshakable authority reduced to two aging figures hunched at a table, and as I left the courtroom, the setting sun spilling through the tall windows, I realized I had stopped shaking somewhere along the way, that my voice had stopped wavering, that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the weak link of this family after all, but the only one strong enough to finally break the cycle. The final day in court dawned with a clarity I hadn't felt in months, as though the storm that had hung over me for so long was finally thinning, and when I walked into that room for the last time, I knew I wasn't there to defend myself anymore. I was there to witness the truth stand on its own. The judge opened with a gravity that made everyone shift in their seats, her voice carrying the weight of not just the law, but of disappointment at the spectacle my family had turned this into, and when she began reading her ruling, the words etched themselves into me like scripture. She declared that the lawsuit against me was without merit, frivolous, an abuse of the court's time and resources, and as she spoke, my heart pounded, not from fear but from a strange, liberating disbelief that after years of being gaslit and guilt-tripped, someone with authority was finally saying out loud what I had always known deep down, that I was not the villain in this story. She dismissed the case entirely, with prejudice, meaning they couldn't come back and try again, and then, almost as an afterthought, but delivered with surgical precision, she ordered my parents and Julia to cover all legal fees. Compensation for the stress and damage their suit had caused me, a number so large that I saw Julia's face drain of color as the reality sank in. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of my mother's soft sobbing, my father's jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might crack, and Julia staring straight ahead, glassy-eyed, her entire performance shattered in an instant. Daniel placed a steady hand on my shoulder, and for the first time I let myself breathe fully, no longer holding air like a prisoner waiting for permission to exist. Walking out of that courthouse, I didn't look back at them. I couldn't, because I knew if I did, I might falter, might mistake pity for forgiveness, and I had nothing left to give them. The reporters outside swarmed, shouting questions about family betrayal and a shocking case of parental favoritism, but their words washed over me like background noise. I wasn't interested in making my pain into a spectacle. I wasn't interested in explaining to the world what it meant to grow up being the daughter who was never enough. All I cared about was the quiet waiting at home, the knowledge that I had finally chosen myself over the endless cycle of sacrifice, that I had drawn a boundary so sharp it cut ties I once thought unbreakable. In the weeks that followed, I blocked their numbers. I sold the last of the heirlooms they'd given me, not out of spite, but as a ritual of severance, a way to free myself from the illusion that our bond had ever been built on unconditional love. Friends asked me if I regretted it, if I missed them, and the truth is complicated. I grieved the parents I wish I'd had, the sister I never truly knew, but I didn't grieve the people who had dragged me into court to drain me dry. They made their choice when they treated me like a bank account instead of a daughter, and I made mine when I walked away for good. Now, months later, the silence is no longer heavy, it's peaceful. I cook dinner in my own kitchen. I wake up without dread pressing against my ribs. I smile without forcing it. I don't know if they still talk about me, if they blame me for everything that fell apart after the ruling, but I do know this. I survived their love, conditional as it was, and I built something stronger in its place. My story doesn't end with reconciliation. It doesn't end with forgiveness handed out like charity. It ends with me free, whole, and unclaimed. And maybe that's the real inheritance I was always meant to take, the one no one can sue me for, the one I had to fight tooth and nail to win, my own life, finally mine.